Hey, it's noon. Time for another hot topic. What do we got going on today? It is Tuesday, June 6th, and we've had an interesting one that came my way, actually from a few different people that I thought, well, gosh, we need to actually figure out then how to do this business when it comes to the aspect of somebody who walks into your open house, they call on your ad, and they're going, what do I do when this person wants to buy the house that I have listed? So therein lies the real question and where we want to take everything today. Really, we're talking agency disclosure, how to be able to do that, what should I do? And here was the email that hopefully many of you got. I threw this out. Here's the scenario. So you're holding an open house. It's your listing. A buyer comes through that you've never ever met before. You have no relationship to them. You don't know them. You couldn't tell them if you saw them 15 minutes earlier or 30 years ago. But they said, I like the house. We want to buy it. We want to make the offer. And we don't have an agent. Can you write it up? So that's the scenario that I created for everybody. Now here's then, I gave you 6 options. So option number 1 was complete the purchase agreement, make them sign a buyer agency agreement, and agency disclosure that you're a buyer's agent. Now, there was a key on that one. Make them sign a buyer agency agreement. Can we make buyers do that? No. So if you just think about it, if we can't make people do anything, then that would exclude that answer. Number 2, I gave you an option was to complete the purchase agreement and have them sign the agency disclosure that you're a seller's agent. What say you? I have one hand that confidently came up in here. Let me go to answer number 3. It was complete the purchase agreement and have them sign the agency disclosure as a dual agent. Or number 4 was advise them that you can complete the purchase agreement, but will refer them to another agent in the office. Yeah, I'm getting this kind of thing going on out there. It's like we've got to get some people to commit here. You know, it's kind of, and I can't see everybody's faces out here, but when you get down to it, that's the reason this came up, because we need to know confidently what will we do if we get this circumstance. So let's see, what else did I give you? Oh, number 5, none of the above. Anyone? Houston, I have one hand that went up. She's cheating. I don't know. I need more answer or more information. And, you know, you could, if you actually did look at that, you could say that that would be a right answer. I will tell you that number 5 would be a good answer, none of the above. And I'll tell you why in a second here. The intended correct answer was number 2. Because we don't know who these people are. And we'll talk about why that would be. But someone, and actually it was Kyle Matta, I don't know if he was giving me a hard time but he picked up on a key little thing, and actually Val was saying she was thinking about it too, but she knew my intention behind the question. Guys, before we do anything, what must we do by law? Disclose our agency relationship to all parties to the transaction. So before we could write up a purchase agreement, what do we have to do? disclose. So if number 2 actually said, sign an agency disclosure stating that you're a seller's agent and then write up the purchase agreement, that would have been the best answer. But as it is, number 2 is the way that we would like to go. Now, why then is the question. Why should we do it that way? Well, let me throw the different scenario out. This buyer who happens to walk through is an old friend from say 10 years ago. Matter of fact, not only is she an old friend, she's a client, a previous client of mine. She bought a house working with me, and then she ended up selling a house, and now she's moving back to the area and came into this open house. Got the scenario? So this is now group participation time. What should I disclose to my friend, previous client, Janet, as to my working relationship when she says, I like this, I want to buy it? What do we do? What say you? Tell them I represent the seller. I've got a couple of telling me represent the sellers. Who else? Oh, nobody.
Have you signed a disclosure with her first?
Nope, she just walked into the open house.
But you know that she's going to be that she's going to be your client.
Cheryl knows where I'm going. She's worked with me before on this. Let me throw something else out. The seller whom I represent happens to be a relocation deal where they took the house into inventory, which basically means I've never met this seller. I don't know who they are. I have no relationship with them at all. They're no more than a piece of paper that they happen to put their signature on. Who's my client clearly right now? That would be the seller. This really non-living entity that bought this house through relocation, third-party relocation company. I do have a live contact who signed that paperwork. Likely I'll never talk to them. And then my friend Janet, previous client, purchased a home from me, bought a home from me. You're a human being. Whom are you going to represent? We must represent the seller, but are you telling me that you'll never represent Janet? That you could stay away from that? You're human. You already have this established relationship. Matter of fact, it was a client relationship you have had established with her previously. Now, my guidance, I want you to represent both parties because I think you're going to do it anyway. And you know what we call that? When you represent somebody by your actions, by your words, what do we call that? Implied agency. Through those actions, through those words, you've implied agency. And this is your good friend Janet, previous client, previous customer. You're going to tell me that you'll never do anything that would give her any indication that you were representing her, or worse yet, that your seller you'd never do anything that would give them any indication that you were representing this good friend of yours. I think you know that where I'm going is we're going to do it anyway. And if I take you back to pre-1995, before we had agency disclosure, that was going on all the time, which is the reason we have agency disclosure, because we were practicing something which is really bad, which is undisclosed agency. When you were representing someone, but you didn't tell them. In an undisclosed dual agency, your relationship changed with the seller because through your actions, through your implications, you were doing it. So I guess I want you to catch this. You're doing it anyway. Do it openly, do it legally by disclosing to all parties that you do represent now both parties. In our first scenario, this person walked off the street. We have no idea who they are. If we were to represent them now, we would become a dual agent because we represent both if we were to do that. And what happened to your fiduciary duties to the seller? You owed everything that the listing contract said you owed, which definitely means 100% confidentiality and 100% disclosure, accountability, reasonable care, all those fiduciary responsibilities. But now you bring in another party whom you represent, whom you owe the same things to. What happens to the responsibilities or fiduciary duties that you owe each? Both are dropped, because here's the thing. We always hold 100% confidentiality. Cannot disclose anything, do anything that would harm either party's negotiating position. So therefore, what happened to your duties of disclosure? Minimized. So I need you to think about that. So that's the typical one. Somebody whom you do not know says, I want to buy your listing. And we're going, what do we do? Well, listen, go ahead and write it up. But when it comes to agency, it is not, and this is the key part. This is where the myth, the legend, the misunderstanding, the misinformation comes out. It is this that is the misinformation. If I have the listing and I'm writing the purchase agreement, the myth, the misunderstanding is that I represent both parties. It's dual agency. No, not until you represent both parties. Just because I write up a purchase agreement doesn't mean that I represent both parties. It doesn't mean I represent the buyer. It's when you decide and you disclose that you represent the buyer and you already represent the seller. Now you've become a dual agent. And question is, well, what do we do in that situation? Well, here's the first part. I'm going to disclose that I represent the buyer because I'm going to sign that buyer to a contract. That's the next step. Sign a buyer representation agreement because I want this buyer to work with me. Again, if I choose to represent, I'm going to disclose that I represent the buyer. A buyer representation contract will fall, because if this deal does not come together, do I still want this buyer? The answer is yes. I want to represent this buyer. If I can't put them together on the deal that I've got with my listing, let me go find them another house. Now that's, again, if I choose to represent. Now what's the last part that I have to now do because I represent two parties to the same transaction? Now I've got to notify not only the seller, but I need to notify the buyer. I'm a dual agent now on this transaction. So that disclosure in the change of your agency has to occur for both parties. And there's a dual agency disclosure that should be part of your packets. And let me also say this, that look, your manager's responsible for you. So when you run into these circumstances, talk with them. See what they want you to do. What's really, it's just a discussion basis really as to what might be the thing to do. Now, here would be the other circumstance. I choose not to represent the buyer. What happens first? Same thing, disclosure, right? We're going to do the disclosure. And if I am not representing the buyer, what do I check on the disclosure statement? That I'm a seller's agent. And of course, we know that we always check the top box. It's automatic if you're using Transaction Desk or Remind Docs Plus, that we are a designated agency company, and the buyer signs. Now, put the purchase agreement together. And here's the thing. Some of you go, you're kind of doubting me a little bit on this, but let me change and give you another scenario. We're doing a great job with this market and in representing a buyer. Now, we got them under contract. We first met them. We picked them up off of a Facebook group. They said, hey, I'm moving into this area. Anybody selling? You see it and you think, what the heck? I'm going to use your scenario if you can't tell. So you do a great job. You say, look, I'd love to be able to help you out. Are you familiar with the techniques that I use to help buyers buy the new homes at the lowest possible price? And they say no. And you say, well, I'll tell you what, why don't we do this? Let's do a Zoom meeting, seeing you're in Ohio, and I'll let you know all the things I'm going to do to be able to help you find that home. Most importantly, even looking for homes that aren't even on the market. Would that be of interest to you? They say yes. So you do this Zoom meeting remotely over the Memorial Day weekend. You did this, and they signed a contract along with the agency disclosure, allowing you to represent them and find them a new home. Quite a scenario, isn't it? By the way, I have one of my new agents that actually just did this. Yes, applause. Right? That's a gutsy move, and she did this. Got a buyer representation contract signed remotely. Why? Because she did all the right things, and they said, yeah, it would only make sense. So now, here's what we're doing. We call upon a FSBO that meets the criteria of what our buyer is looking for. And with that, they show, we go out, we do all the right things just to get that to happen. And the buyer says, I like it, let's buy it. So now you're writing up the offer, and whom do you represent? The buyer. Do I represent the FSBO? No. Do I need to represent the FSBO? Can you make the FSBO sign a contract? No. And guys, what's the difference? There is none. Because we just simply reversed the situation. So we would do that. Why would we think that we've got to represent both parties? We don't. We already represent the buyer. Go in, represent the buyer. And if you're worried about your commission, okay, there's an agreement out there for that. It's part of the package. And you simply state that I represent the buyer, but you're still agreeing to pay, if that's the way you choose to do it. There's other ways to be able to make that happen. But you see, that one we're comfortable with. It's on the other side that we're not. I could confuse you more, but when it comes to the aspect of what do you do, that's a simplicity to it. So I want you to know what you do really represents on what's the right thing. What's in the best interest of the current client. And yet, if this buyer, and by the way, when I gave you the scenario where it was a relocation seller, and it was well, here it was Cardis at the time period. Cardis was my client. So with Cardis as my client, I never even had conversation with the individual who's signing the papers. And yet it was a previous seller previous buyer. Matter of fact, it was a previous seller twice, previous buyer once. He was a friend of my youngest son. You get an idea of where I'm going. How could I not represent him? It would only make sense. Matter of fact, I had a great deal of confidential information from previous sales that I couldn't disclose anyway. So it only makes sense in that scenario that I do represent both. And because I now represent the buyer, I represent the seller, I have dual agency. So it's really about a matter of choice, what you do in regards to your disclosure and what actions you take as far as representing the buyer. So, questions you guys may have, throw them out. Let's put them out there. Take yourself off mute, put yourself in the chat. We'll give you a few seconds here to throw those out, because I'm sure this is about as clear as mud. Anyone? Really?
Me.
Me. Go, Cheryl.
Where does transaction coordinator fit into this then?
Oh, the
do a
good
quick
old
call.
transaction coordinator. My years of teaching and experience. This is a really, Cheryl, I leave this to the managers, but I will tell you where my guidance comes to on this. I think it's a rare circumstance, and at this point, I don't even know when I would recommend it any longer. Transaction coordinator. See my piece of paper and how thin that is. Now, here's the transaction coordinator. You have to stand on this and not lean one side or the other. Oops. You see it? It's hard. Just that wee bit. You just went to one side, therefore you implied agency of that person. And the other thing is that I think people misunderstand what a transaction coordinator is really supposed to do, but it's coordinate, put a transaction together, complete it, get it to the closing. But here's the interesting part. How did we end up in a position where we would want to offer a transaction coordinator? Typically it's because, well, we'll stay with my friend Janet. She was talking with her neighbor that she was going to be moving, and her neighbor said, well, gee, I've got my daughter. I would love for her to be able to have your house. You say, well, if she'll give me 400,000, I'll let her have it. So they come up to an agreement. They got everything put in place. And Janet calls you up and says, hey, Cheryl, here's what's happened, but I don't know what to do. Would you just close this for me? Well, that's all I need, because it just needs to be put on paper. We've got all the agreement. It's ready to go. I just need somebody to close it because I really don't know what to do. That's a typical scenario where we will have completed a transaction coordinator. But here's the thing. It goes back to your good friend Janet came to you and said, you know, we've had this great relationship, and, you know, I was going to list my home with you. You didn't know that yet, but, you know, you sold me the other homes, and you sold the homes for me previously, and now I'm selling this one. I'm sorry, but, you know, can I pay you to just take care of this and close it? And you say yes. And what do we think we need to be? Transaction coordinator. So you're telling me that the buyer, whom you don't know, never met, have no idea who they are, you're going to not represent Janet and not represent this other person who you have no relationship with?
No.
I guess my thought is simply this. I got to close the transaction. I'm going to represent Janet. She's the one that came to me.
Right.
She's the one who's going to pay me. So why do a transaction coordinator? All we're talking about is, yep, I represent you. So that's my perspective on it, and the reason why. I'll tell you that management experience, I had one of my agents had a very bad experience with it. It would have been easier if she'd have just known that she was not a transaction coordinator, but she was a seller's agent. It was the seller who came to her anyway. It was the seller who was going to pay her. It would have been much easier had she openly been representing that seller. So does that help, Cheryl? I think you kind of knew that and you kind of put that out there for me, but that's a great one.
Yep.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Awesome. All right. And there's another one here. If you are a dual agent and the house does not appraise and the seller does not want to meet the appraised value, I would like to keep both clients. Would I then need to have a buyer contract for the buyer and put the listing back on the market? No harm, no foul. So this is, Holly put it out here in the chat. So here's a key, Holly. It's the way you started your question. If you are a dual agent, what do you have signed by both the buyer and seller already? I have an agency disclosure with the seller. I have a listing agreement with the seller. I have those two things. When I got the buyer, I did an agency disclosure. I also got the buyer representation contract. And then that third document for each party to sign was the one party, well, I think it's called the one party commission agreement. I think that's what it's called. Don't hold me to that. But it's where I can go on and disclose to both parties that now I'm a dual agent. I represent both of you. And here's how I get paid. So because we were a dual agent, there's no need for me to sign a buyer contract because I already have it. That's why I was saying that I would sign the agency disclosure as a buyer's agent, then follow with buyer representation contract, and then follow redisclosure to both parties that I'm now a dual agent. So now if the deal falls apart, we had the agreement, didn't appraise, seller wouldn't come down, buyer wouldn't come up, they couldn't meet in the middle, they sign a mutual release, I still have the listing, I still have the buyer. And it was because, Holly, you stated that I'm a dual agent. Now, had I not done dual agency, I did not represent the buyer, I would have stayed representing the seller only. I'd be going to the buyer, hey, let me help you find a home. Are you familiar with the ways, techniques that I do to help buyers find a new home at the lowest possible price? Nope. Then let's get back together. I want to take care of you. Let's find out what you're looking for. And then I'm going to have them sign agency disclosure and the agency contract. Hope that brought clarity to it. Do we have any others out there? Guys, I can tell you if you've had any confusion over this situation, I've had many agents, brand new, very experienced, and highly productive, who still get confused because of the way that people have taught agency. So just remember, agency is not required. It can be created by signing a contract, obviously. It can be created by signing an agency disclosure. It can be created by the words that we use, the actions that we take. But simply because we have a listing and we write an offer for a buyer on that listing doesn't mean that it's dual agency. It's not until we determine how we're representing each of the parties, if there is representation at all, to create dual agency. So I hope this brings clarification. If you need anything, don't be afraid to send me an email, a text, and we will be able to get back to you on that. So guys, that wraps up another Hot Topic Tuesday, but let me share with you what's coming up. We have next week, Ask the Attorney. Please send me email with any questions so that Rick can be prepared that you may have. I've already let him know that we're going to want to talk about ladybird deeds. Not something that you learned in pre-license training from that name, but you did learn about it. And I forwarded a couple of the questions to him. The following week, many of you kind of get a little bit frustrated with the signing of the wire fraud. And you think, that's never going to happen to me. That won't even happen within our company. Guess what? It happened. To the tune of thousands and tens of thousands of dollars lost by one of our buyers and lost on a transaction. So think about being homeless and you just lost tens of thousands of dollars. It happens. So we're going to have an attorney from Fidelity Title on with us who's going to talk further about wire fraud. I hope it lands and will hit a little heartstring, because Lord knows I wouldn't want that to happen to one of my people, but it's happened to one of ours. Okay. After that, you're going to have Alex Peck, myself, and Bob DeVore. We're going to talk about creative ways that we could and should be looking for business in this market, doing things that are out of the ordinary that could make you more comfortable in making contacts. And then for our next deep dive after that, got a gentleman who's in Florida, an old friend of mine from back in my Coal Banker Weir Manual days, Ken Posick, is going to be on with us. Ken grew his business. Listen, he did probably 30, 40, 50 deals a year that he grew his business to here. He left our area, Northville is where he was at, went down to Orlando, cold turkey, rebuilt his business. And he now has his own team of about 30 agents. And I'm going to have Ken share what he's done, because he's done a lot of it using video and social media. So that's going to be our July Hot Topic deep dive. So that's what's coming up. Just want you to know that in advance, guys. There's some good stuff. Hope you enjoyed today. We'll talk to you soon. See you next week.